Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this hybrid meeting of the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. Please silence all electronic devices. Anybody that would like to testify, again, you can sign up at the sergeant's desk. For those people that would like to email testimony, you can email it to us at testimony@council.nyc.gov. Again, that is testimony@council.nyc.gov. Chair, we're ready to begin.
Good morning and welcome. Is it still morning? Almost. Thank you everyone for being patient as we get ourselves acquainted to this world of Zoom. And welcome to the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. My name is Keith Powers. I'm the chair of this committee. And before we get moving, I'd like to introduce the council members of the committee who have joined us here today. We're joined by our speaker, Adrian Adams. Minority Leader Joe Borelli is here, and I think we'll be back. Councilmember Justin Brannon, Councilmember Gail Brewer, Councilmember Crystal Hudson, Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers. I believe Councilmember Sanchez is joining us via Zoom shortly, and we'll be joined by others as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the council's general counsel sitting next to me, Jason Otano, serving as committee counsel, and the staff members of the council's investigative unit, Francesca Della Vecchia, director of compliance and investigations unit, and investigators Alicia Vassal and Ramses Boudin as well. And welcome to all of the folks that are here today being nominated. Today we're going to consider a number of nominations for a number of vital public bodies here in New York City. The first two candidates under consideration for direct appointments by the City Council to the Equal Employment Practices Commission. Nicole Yearwood has been nominated to serve out the remainder of a 4-year term that expires June 30th, 2024. And Nagazi Okaro, but you're going to have to correct me if I was wrong on that pronunciation, has been nominated to serve the remainder of a 4-year term that expires June 30th, 2023. The next candidate, Christine Yoon, has been nominated by the mayor for an appointment as a member to the Board of Standards and Appeals, serving the remainder of a 6-year term that expires on September 1st, 2027. Finally, we'll consider 3 nominations to the New York City Planning Commission. Juan Camilo Osorio has been nominated by the Brooklyn Borough President, and if appointed, will serve the remainder of a 5-year term that expires on June 30th, 2027. The mayor has nominated 2 appointees to the New York City Planning Commission, who are both here with us today, David Gold and Rasma Kermani Fry. Should Mr. Gold receive the advice and consent of the City Council, he will serve the remainder of a 5-year term that expires on June 30th, 2026. I hope you're paying attention to all these dates here. Should Mrs. Kermani Fry receive the advice and consent of the City Council, she will serve the remainder of a 5-year term that expires on June 30th, 2024. We are going to begin today with the candidates for the New York City Equal Employment Practices Commission. Under the city charter, the EEPC is charged with the duties of reviewing, evaluating, and monitoring the employment practices, procedures, and programs of city agencies and the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. The goal is to continue an effective affirmative employment program of equal employment opportunity for minority group members and women employed by or seeking employment with city agencies. Some specific powers are monitoring employment practices of all local agencies, reviewing the implementation of agencies' affirmative employment programs, and auditing agencies' efforts to ensure fair and effective equal employment opportunities for minority group members and women. The EEPC consists of 5 members, 2 appointed by the mayor and 2 appointed by the City Council. The mayor and speaker jointly appoint the chair. Compensation is on a per diem basis, $250 for a member and $275 for the chair. We would today like to welcome Ms. Yearwood and Ms. Okaro to the chamber. Can you please both raise your right hand to be sworn in?
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Thank you. We would like to welcome both nominees to make an opening statement. But before that, I'm going to now turn to the speaker. Sorry. You can make your opening statement first. We're going to now ask the nominees to make their opening statement. Thanks.
Good morning, Speaker Adams, Chairperson Powers, and members of the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. I am honored to be considered for an appointment to the Equal Employment Practices Commission by this council, the most diverse council in the city's history. I am excited about the opportunity to serve my city in this capacity. Since my time as an undergraduate, I have worked on issues of representation of historically underrepresented voices. As an adult, I have witnessed the positive impact of having all voices present in the rooms where decisions are made. Having everyone at the table is critically important when the goal is to make decisions for and to serve a city as diverse as ours, which is the role of our city agencies. People of diverse backgrounds, cultures, and experiences are what make New York City, New York City. With the city being its largest employer, its workforce should naturally reflect the people who are here. Unfortunately, we know that is not always the reality. As a nation, we are striving for fairness and inclusion in all areas of public life. We are working to correct and overcome historical disparities in education, which by extension have caused disparities in access to employment opportunities for generations of women and minorities. We have begun to recognize the intersectionality of race and gender and its combined impact on a person's experience in the workforce. Our city's workforce is not immune. Watching past meetings and reviewing staffing data, I can see how gender roles and stereotypes have factored into the employment composition of our agencies. This commission, in its role, can ensure fairness and equity in the agency's hiring and promotion of employees, and it can create new opportunities for individuals and future generations. We often speak of the importance of representation for the next generation. Even in a city as diverse as ours, there are historically underrepresented communities in many of our city agencies. This is especially true for young girls and other marginalized people. We must also look at the financial benefit for the groups the Commission is mandated to assist, especially during the pandemic. Data has shown that women, especially women from minority groups, have suffered the most when it comes to job loss. Women's advancement in the workforce has seen major setbacks due to the pandemic. Job loss means loss of benefits, possible pension, and all benefits that come with city employment. Eliminating systemic inequities that lead to the undue burden of job loss on a particular group for generations is something we can resolve. These are just a few priorities I would like to bring to the Commission. The Commission has begun the work. I intend to bring my expertise, passion, and commitment to help bring about change in the city's hiring practices and build a talent pipeline that positively impacts communities. Together, we can help our city break down barriers to unfair hiring practices and be a model for others to follow. I would just like to conclude my remarks also by thanking the City Council's Investigation Committee for all their help through this process.
Thank you. You go, and then we'll come to questions after.
Good morning, Speaker Adams, Chair Powers, committee members, officials, staff, and New Yorkers. My name is Ngozi Okaro, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my background and suitability as an appointee to the Equal Employment Practices Commission. A bit about me. I am a Black person, a woman, born in the United States, but the child of an immigrant. I am gender conforming, have some disability. I am a Christian and a native English speaker. None of the above should provide advantage or disadvantage, but many of these data points do provide advantage and disadvantage. Some of the most important things about me are that I believe in fairness for all. I'm a systems thinker, a researcher, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, a lifelong learner, and one of New York City's biggest fans. I did not grow up in New York, but consider myself a naturalized New Yorker since I've lived here for more than 20 years and have lived in 3 boroughs. I moved to New York because it represented to me a place where people can be who they are and contribute to a thriving community. It takes the best of all of us to keep New York City great, and I believe that people must feel confident that they will be treated fairly in order to give their best in community and especially at their workplaces. I work as executive director of Custom Collaborative, a nonprofit social enterprise that supports no and low income women who are creating careers in sustainable fashion. I started Custom Collaborative to provide opportunity to women who have been marginalized and to guide the fashion industry to become more equitable and inclusive. My organization works with women who come from 25 different countries, and equity and inclusion are part of our organizational core values. I instituted trainings and policies and standardized ways of working with people so they will not feel like they are subject to favor or to whim. The staff and participants at Custom Collaborative regularly go through trainings, and we have had our materials and practices audited and evaluated by others. I have experienced someone reviewing my work, so I understand what it is like to hear that what we designed could be better, even though I've put forth my best efforts. But because the goal is to provide equal opportunity, I understand that the impact and not the intent is what matters. So I sit before you, honored to be entrusted with auditing, reviewing, and monitoring the employment practices of the City of New York to help sustain a fair workplace for all, including women, minorities, the disabled, and all people. I personally have worked with many organizations in New York, including Phipps Neighborhoods and Brooklyn Hospital Center, law firms like Good Kind Labaton, and others. I'm also a Coro Leadership New York graduate. I bring to the table and to this work the person who decided at age 6 to be a lawyer to advocate for justice. I also bring before you the person who decided at age 30 that practicing corporate law in a large law firm was not going to measurably advance justice. I commit to bringing all of the skills and lessons that I've learned to the EPC to serve the city, its entities, and its citizens. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We're going to now turn to Speaker Adria Adams for a few questions, and then I'll ask a few questions to follow. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and good morning to our illustrious candidates, and congratulations to all of you on your nominations. Happy to have you here in the People's House. I'm going to first start with you, Ms. Yearwood. Welcome once again, and congratulations. In your pre-hearing questions, you stated specific concerns about the city's ability to attract people and how that may be affected because of the mandated back to work requirement. How would you balance this with concerns about perceived public opinions that the city's workforce should be at the workplace?
Thank you so much for the question, Speaker Adams. I think that what I've observed from some people who I know who are employed by city entities, agencies, some elected officials' offices, is that there is flexibility based on the current pandemic numbers and rates. So I think that having some flexibility around that based on what is going on currently with our healthcare system and with the COVID numbers, I think would go a long way to helping to facilitate some sort of balance.
Okay, thank you for that. Are you at all concerned with equity issues that may arise with parts of the city's workforce having the benefit of a hybrid work model when other employees, such as our essential workers, don't have that same opportunity?
Right, thank you once again. I think that we would, we definitely should consider various roles and people's positions. I believe that if someone is an essential worker, that there should be something for them to mitigate that as well. I'm not exactly sure what that should be as yet, but I think that everyone, considering all that happened and what I've seen, I've been fortunate. I actually was working from home for years prior to the pandemic. And there are benefits to coming in office at times, but you also like and enjoy that flexibility. It was, of course, beneficial during the pandemic to be able to transition. And I do understand that some people couldn't transition because of the nature of their work. So it is difficult for some who are essential, but I think that there's definitely room, whether that's giving time off, spacing that out, to allow more people, so some people will have to come in, maybe they have time off, then another group comes in. That was one of the things that worked. Even when I worked from home, there were some people who had to go in, so they staggered hours. So there was a schedule, week A, some people came in, week B, others came in.
Thank you. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And taking a look at the big picture and realizing that there are ways to work with quote unquote hybrid perspectives and completely in-person perspectives. So I think that's totally fair. Thank you for your response to that. Ms. Okaro, welcome to you as well. We have something in common as I was reading and listening to you speak and hearing that you had a bit of a break with your corporate life, as I did with mine. At a certain point in your corporate life, you decided to break from it because I guess, perhaps like myself, there was something on the inside that just wasn't working there.
Right.
Realizing that there was a bigger picture and something larger to fulfill because of intestinal fortitude. So I recognize that. So in your pre-hearing questions, you state that your entire career has focused on ensuring safe and just spaces for people to work. Could you please expand on that for us?
Absolutely. Just to give a little bit more background, when I was 6 and I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer, it was because somebody said, "Little girl, you talk a lot, you should be a lawyer." My mother is a librarian, and so everything I wanted to know, I had to look up. And so when I looked up what lawyers did and found out who they were, I realized that Ralph Nader was a lawyer who fought against Ford, which was particularly important because we had a Pinto, and one day when my mother was driving me to school, our car caught on fire. And so I was like, okay, so there is a person, there are types of people who can help to bring justice and fairness and equity, and that's the type of person that I wanted to be. I always thought that I would work on women's and children's issues, and in fact, when I was in law school, I worked in a domestic violence clinic that helped people who were trying to get orders of protection. And basically, as I said, that has always been my goal. I have a few core values, and among them include justice. And so even when I have not been practicing law, and although I've never worked in HR, I've always advocated for just treatment for myself, but also mostly for others.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll just ask one more question. In your pre-hearing question, similar to the question that I asked Ms. Yearwood, you state that an employment practice that might affect the work of EEPC is, quote, work from home policies. So in light of any experiences that you may have had over the last 2 years or so, do you have any insight as to work from home policies and which policies work best?
Yes, and I have a different type of leadership style than maybe what would work with the city with such a large workforce and unions, but I try to engage my team in collaborative thinking about what our return to office process is, how many people we'll have in the office, even though the state and the city have recommended however many people per square foot. Do we feel comfortable about that? And so for me, it's very important to find out what it is that people want, what works for everyone, and then to involve them in the process. Some of our work requires us to be in person, and so for me, it seemed to be only fair that even those of us who don't have to work in person all the time, that we would still work in person so people would not feel like there was like almost a segregated or essential and non-essential, because all of us are essential in terms of making the work go forward. But for me, it has been about being very in tune to what people want and need, especially as we think about some people who are parents and their children might get sick or school might close, and also balancing that with what is fair and reasonable and will keep the organization going as smoothly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, both of you. I'm going to turn it back over into the hands of the chair.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Madam Speaker. Just a few questions myself, and I'm going to hand it over to members to ask questions as well. Starting with to Ms. Acaro, in your pre-hearing questions, you mentioned the need for popular confidence as essential to effective equal employment opportunity programs. Can you expand in terms of what you mean on that, and how do you think you personally can help the EPC to improve this popular confidence?
Sure, and I think that popular confidence is a phrase that I just kind of made up, but it means to me that people trust that those who are to regulate us and determine our workspaces, and that we're all working under the same rules, that people have confidence in that. I think that we can see, even looking, I would say especially looking at our federal government, right, there is a crisis of confidence. Some people believe elections work, some people don't believe that elections work. And so in order to actually do effective work, people have to have confidence that there are rules, that the rules are applicable to everyone, that the rules are understandable, and why the rules exist in the first place. I think that all of those things are important if we want people to, again, come to work and do their best and not just do what they need to do and be grumpy. We really want people, I think, to be confident and comfortable in their workplaces and know that in the event that something does happen, there's a process, that everyone goes through the same process, and that it is objective as possible.
Got it. And maybe just a second part of the question, can you talk how you specifically, if appointed to the EPC, would improve on this public confidence or instill that into the agency and the work they do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think that part of the answer is understanding if and what the issues are, like why people don't feel confident, if that is in fact the case. And as I said, I'm a researcher, and part of solving any problem is actually finding out how it manifests itself, like what is the symptom, and then figuring out what is the root. So I can't say today what I would do, but it would be a robust and thoughtful process along with the other commissioners.
Okay. I'm going to move to Ms. Yearwood for a second. I know that you had also in your questions had a pre-hearing questionnaire and mentioned that you have a plan to increase awareness about the EEPC. Can you give us some examples of how you think that can be improved and what you might do to help improve that?
Sure. So my background is government relations, community outreach as well. I would probably implore some of the tactics I used as a partnership specialist for the census. I could even go back to my days as a community liaison. I think one of the important things is having people understand the civil service exam and application process and how that works. So I would begin to tap into local organizations, you know, traditional ones. For example, our local community boards, maybe with expanded, you know, staffing, and two additional commissioners, maybe going out and really talking to people working with DCAS to educate them about the process and how to apply. So we could start with local community boards. We could start with community-based organizations. I'm a member of several. I'm a member of a sorority, a member of the NAACP. developed connections with several faith-based organizations during my work with the census. So I would tap in to a lot of the partners that I've developed over the last 4 to 5 years specifically to talk to them about how to gain city employment. And I will work with my fellow commissioners on that work as well as the commission staff.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to take a moment to move over to colleagues here to ask some questions. We have first Councilmember Brewer, followed by Councilmember Hudson.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'm going to say is Alden Bonilla, who will be your chair, is the best chair in the United States.
Yes.
He was my deputy as borough president, and there's nobody better. So congratulations to be working with him. That's number one. The second issue is picking up on what the speaker stated. All the agencies have no staff. And so her comments, I know law department's down 150, and the list goes on. And I give the mayor credit because he wants others to come back in the city. And so the city, he thinks, should be 5 days a week. I think it's a great idea, but nobody's going to work here for 5 days a week. And they're telling me, and they're telling the world. Right. So picking up on what the speaker stated, you know, because of COVID and all the effects, what would you think to do to attract you know, folks to come, not only for the civil service talent, which is part of what we need, but also just in general? Would you urge the mayor to do part-time? Would you urge, or maybe keep it full-time? How would you address this massive lack of people applying for these jobs? That's number one. And then the second, of course, is just, I think there's probably still a pink ghetto at the civil service. We love the union. We respect them. I worked in a union shop. I was the head of a union shop. But I do think often there is a pink ghetto, as I call it. And so I want to know how you would address those two issues. Thank you.
I never heard of that phrase, so you might need to explain that one.
Pink ghetto means women at the bottom.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, that's a new term. Okay. I think that in terms of the first part of your question, I would probably encourage some flexibility. That is why I did raise that as a concern, because now there's so many other, you know, opportunities for people that are offering that flexibility of this hybrid, you know, work from home. So I would encourage, you know, the mayor, and again, it would be we would also have to look at the data. Who actually needs to physically be in the workplace to accomplish their jobs? Because sometimes there are situations where people need to physically be there. And then how do we offer them flexibility, but as well as being open? Because it's really about us. We want to attract, of course, the best and the brightest to these roles. And when they have so many other businesses that are offering this flexibility, they have choices. And so they're going with those other options, as you've already stated, that they're looking to bring, you know, people don't want to come back. We have to somehow evolve with the times while making sure the city runs efficiently. I also understand that part of it as well is probably driven by economics. We have businesses that thrive based on people coming into the workplace, local restaurants, specific communities. I know I used to work down here in Lower Manhattan when I was at 1 Center Street, working for the borough president's office. There were businesses that are only open on the weekdays because they dealt with traffic from people who worked at those buildings, and then they would close on the weekends because we weren't there. So it's negotiating a lot of things, and it's a complex issue. I'm not going to pretend I can answer it in this hearing, but I think that we need to examine all of those things so that we can attract more people to come in and apply for these roles. Okay. In terms of addressing the pink ghetto, so to speak, I think that that's not a unique issue. That unfortunately, in terms of just, you know, historically, it's always, we find that women are the backbone of a lot of organizations. So I think once, as a member of the commission, when we're examining the data and seeing how it's reflected in our city's workforce, I think that's one of the things we can address during the audit period and recommend corrective actions that are taken. And we can probably work to suggest ways that agencies can mitigate that. So if we see that that's reflected in the data of an agency, okay, what ways can you work to ensure that women are moving up the ranks?
Okay, thank you. And I love custom collaborative, as you know, and visiting was fabulous. Go ahead. Same issue, same question.
So thank you so much. I am new to this, the pink ghetto question, phrase. And so I think that there are two different things that we have to consider. One is, what are the formal ways that promotion and retention, how do they operate? And then the other question is, what are the informal ways? Who is encouraged to apply for positions? Are we reviewing applications on a blind basis, like not knowing the people's names? So I think that there are lots of ways to modernize systems. And I also think that as great as New York is, it's always important to look to others to see what they're doing. So are other municipalities, whether here or internationally, do they have better rates of women being promoted in higher level positions? And if so, what has worked and what can we adopt? And so sometimes I think it takes a step back and reframing of the issue. And then, of course, creating some new processes and training and making people accountable to the outcomes through key performance indicators or whatever else. And I think that that is one of the most important things, making it someone accountable for it. Like, whose job performance takes into account where women are within the city agencies. I'm sorry, you had another question.
The other question is how you're going to handle picking up on the excellent question by the speaker. We've got nobody applying for jobs in the city of New York, and it's because the outside has a different schedule, and it's all COVID related. So how would you address that? It's
right.
Law department's down 150 out.
Wow. Yes, I think it is also a question of realism, and just to I think everything that Nicole said is absolutely right. And I also think that my personal experience as an employer would also inform some of what, how I would address it and how I think about it. For example, our staff, except for the people who have to be in person every day because they're working with participants, we have one day a week that people have to go to work. But I recently lost a very good employee because he went somewhere where they could work from home every day,
Yep.
right? So 80% time off, time at home is not enough for some people. And so I think it's about being realistic. And so then for me, that made me think, okay, what are the other things that we can do to attract and retain the people who we really want to be with us? And that has shown up in a few ways in my organization, including like self-care, bonuses, extended time. Again, I recognize that the city workforce is different, and there are some things that can and cannot be done, and there's different regulations and unions, but I feel like we could all think a little bit more creatively, understanding how important it is to have a fully staffed city and fully staffed agencies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're also going to welcome Councilmember Salamanca here and Councilmember Sanchez. We're just going to very quickly test Councilmember Sanchez, her audio on Zoom.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
All right, we got you. We hear you. Welcome. We're now going to call on Councilmember Hudson, followed by Councilmember Brooks Powers.
Thank you, Chair Powers. And hello, congratulations for your nominations. Ms. O'Caro, you just sort of addressed one of the questions that I had, or I guess the question that I had. And so, Ms. Yearwood, I would love to hear from you as coming from the private sector and being at an organization like Lime. Are there any current values or practices that you would bring to the EEPC, or things that you think the city could be doing or learning from what you're seeing in the private sector?
I would definitely say, of course, and I haven't been private sector long, just 6 months. Most of my career has been in the public sector and in government. But I would say that one of the key pieces of our mission is we say that we want to create transportation that is shareable and affordable, as well as carbon-free. And in that mission, we strive, our team, and we're global, to make sure that our services are accessible to everyone. And I think that I can bring that specifically to serve in this commission, where that is our goal, is to make sure that everyone is involved and engaged and has equal access.
Thank you. And I'll just end with just a statement. I've read through both of your resumes and responses to the questions. I think you're both very qualified to be on the commission. And again, I congratulate you. My partner was actually formerly the chair of the EEPC, and so I would encourage you to make sure that you continue to push these institutions that are historically discriminatory. And I think both of you as Black women can probably identify more so than maybe some other folks how these systems work against people like us. And so I just encourage you that no matter what, you're being appointed by, institutions. And I just encourage you to push those institutions to be the best that they absolutely can be. Thank you.
I'd like to do that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think Councilmember Brooks Powers had to step out, so we're going to keep moving. Thank you both for your testimony. We're now going to move on to the Board of Standards and Appeals. Moving on to BSA, just a little bit of background for folks. The BSA consists of 5 commissioners, each appointed to the mayor for a term of 6 years. The city charter provides that one of the BSA's members shall be a planner with professional qualifications and at least 10 years experience as a planner. One of the members shall be a registered architect and should have at least 10 years experience as an architect. And one of the members should be a licensed professional engineer and should have at least 10 years experience as an engineer. The particular qualifications of the 2 remaining members are not delineated in the charter. The mayor designates one of the members with the required experience of an architect, planner, engineer to serve as chair, and designates another member to serve as vice chair. No more than 2 members may reside in any one borough. Each of the member of the board receives a salary and may not engage in any other occupation, profession, or employment. The chair earns an annual salary of $227,786. The vice chair receives $187,479 annually, while the remaining members earn annual salaries of $174,827. The BSA has the power to determine and vary the application of the zoning resolutions and to issue special permits as authorized by the zoning resolution. The BSA may also consider appeals to vary or modify any rule or regulation of the provisions of any law relating to the construction, use, structural changes, equipment, alteration, or removal of buildings or structures, or vaults on the sidewalks, where there are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships in carrying out the strict letter of the law. So the spirit of the law shall be observed, public safety secured, and substantial justice done. We have a candidate here today. Well, we want to welcome Christine Yoon. If you want to raise your right hand to be sworn in.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You may continue.
You can go ahead and give an opening statement. Thanks.
Is it okay if I remove my mask?
Sure.
Good afternoon, Chair Powers, Speaker Adams, and council members of the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. I'm honored to be here this afternoon to testify before you regarding my nomination as Commissioner of New York City's Board of Standards and Appeals. Both of my parents emigrated to the United States from South Korea in the 70s, starting their American lives as many immigrants do here in New York City. After meeting each other and marrying, they eventually relocated down to Houston, Texas, where I was born and raised. Coincidentally, my first apartment when I moved here was in Sunnyside, Queens, just a couple of blocks from my mother's first apartment in 1972. My life has always been tethered to this city, and since moving here in 2008, I continue to be fascinated and amazed at its rich history and constantly evolving present. I humbly ask for your consideration of my nomination to participate in shaping its exciting future. In my career to date, I have been fortunate to work as an architect, consultant, and real estate developer, and have overseen many executed projects from concept through construction from these different roles. I believe that my perspectives from sitting on multiple sides of the table through a variety of projects equip me with the ability to review issues through a multifaceted and pragmatic lens. A majority of my professional experience has been focused on the design and development of new construction affordable housing in New York City, which has introduced me to communities across multiple boroughs and solidifies my position that safe, welcoming, and well-designed affordable housing is not only possible, but necessary. And by investing in access to housing, we can integrate, stabilize, and uplift communities. I have also worked on projects of various typologies in other cities and countries with entirely different regulatory parameters. This has allowed me to develop my skill set in understanding the intent of and interpretation of codes in new contexts. As a commissioner, I will use my diversity of experience to consistently provide rigorous analyses, fair assessments, and considered judgment that results in decisions that serve the local community, public interest, and the positive evolution of our city. Thank you again for your time, and I welcome any questions that you may have for me in your consideration of my nomination.
Thank you. Hold on 1 second. Okay, great. First, I'm going to hand it over to the speaker, Adrian Adams, and then I'll follow up with some questions myself. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Ms. Yoon. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you. I just have a couple questions for you. Have you sought any advice from the Conflicts of Interest Board in connection to any potential conflicts that may arise between your private architectural practice and your service on the BSA?
I have not, as I am terminating my employment with my current office, of course, and will be full-time as a commissioner. Should such a conflict arise, I will certainly consult them.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I noticed that in your pre-hearing questions, you state that matters before the BSA should be, quote, deliberated upon, specific to that site and the facts presented. What weight should be given to the wishes of the community? I'm a former chairperson of the second largest community board in Queens, so this is of particular interest to me. What weight should be given to the wishes of the community, particularly any recommendations by the community board when considering applications on a case-by-case basis?
It's hard to say as a blanket rule or statement how much the community voice will have an impact ultimately on the decision that the board makes, but of course it's part of the application and in some cases can consist of a much larger portion of the weight than in others. I think given the nature of the application and all of the facts presented and the site's own potential, you have to weigh a number of things, including the community's input, in order to make a fair and objective decision.
I'm just curious, have you attended your local community board meetings?
I have not.
You have not, okay. Okay, okay, I'm gonna turn it back over into the hands of the chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. In some of the past councils, there's been actually focused a little bit on the BSA, and particularly one of my colleagues who was neighboring to me had focused a lot on it, and a feeling there wasn't a lot of transparency. Obviously, I think not a lot of understanding from the public either about exactly what the function of the BSA is, and a feeling that often the decisions were fairly a rubber stamp. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you might address some of those issues, but also expand transparency in the workings of the BSA?
Certainly, as far as I understand the workings of the BSA, all deliberation that we have as commissioners must happen in a public setting. And so the transparency that exists of any sort of thought process or concerns that I may have personally would be before the public in that setting. I'm sorry, there was an earlier part of the question.
Well, I think the question is, and maybe maybe I can just pit off the speaker's questions as well. There were, I think, communities, community boards, council members who had felt often the way that the BSA operated and the votes and the decisions of the BSA often reflected sort of an automatic approval for many of the applications that came before it. And so had wished to see something that reflected a balance between what are the concerns being raised versus the decisions that were coming out of the agency. So I remember being at these hearings and this being a big point of discussion. It also was part of, it was my neighbor and council member, so this was things like my committee was talking about as well. So I guess, that how does one address as a commissioner that feeling that sometimes the communities don't perhaps have even a basic understanding of the BSA and its approvals and its approval processes, but also maybe don't feel like they always are able to communicate and have meaningful input into the outcomes of the board?
Well, I believe that all deliberation that we do have in the public setting needs to clearly address what it is we have the authority to make a decision on and what is under our discretion versus what is statutory or part of code and regulation. And I think providing that transparency in the deliberation is helpful for concerned community members to understand what powers the board actually does have. Of course, when an application comes before the board, it's likely been clear to the applicant what discretion and powers the board does have, but perhaps it's an effort for the commissioners to be clear and transparent as they're deliberating it for the benefit of the larger public and the concerned community. Does that answer your question, Chair?
It does a bit. I mean, I obviously recognize that these are public meetings. I think that also there's a desire to have a better kind of clearer understanding. And perhaps maybe this means modernizing the agency, its mission and its functions and its statutory obligations and everything else, which I think is perhaps also maybe part of the conversation. The BSA sort of sits in a sort of interesting place when it comes to all the other city agencies. We have city planning folks here who have, I think, a more sort of broadcasted function in terms of what their role is in the ULURP process. Things like BSA sort of sits in a interesting place, which I think also sometimes leaves some communities, especially ones that I have a well-resourced community that can hire folks to go and help this process, but often leave others maybe without a clear understanding of that. So I think rather than asking another question about it, I think what I implore folks to do is to maybe look at the agency's overall functions and its role in the whole land use process and figure out a way that the public can better understand what it does and how it might make decisions, update the statutory maybe obligations of it. But I'm asking a lot of you. You're just one commissioner, but I just say this because I do recall this being part of dialogue, but it gets lost because we so rarely encounter BSA as part of our everyday lives, or where no offense to the city planning folks, we see and talk about that those are functions a whole lot. And so I think it is always a good moment as we're talking to folks that are coming before us to also think about what the role of the BSA is and what its obligations or where its discretion where the handoff between those two things might occur. With that being said, I'll hand it over to, first I'm going to go to, oh, sorry, the speaker has one more question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one more, and still looking at your pre-hearing questions. Have you looked at or considered or researched the staffing level at BSA right now?
I have not.
Okay. And around that same issue, as far as your current knowledge of BSA, what's your comfort level with your current knowledge of BSA, its function, and its parameters?
I have a familiarity, of course, with the board's role in land use in New York City. I have not personally worked on a project that has appeared before the board. And I've had some conversations with some of the staff at the BSA, but I'm very eager to learn more, as it's quite premature for me to make any kind of assessment on the staffing or resourcing that currently exists.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. We're going to go to Councilmember Brooks Powers, who I think also had previous questions for the last panel, and then we're going to go to Councilmember Brewer, Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to acknowledge Mrs. Nicole Yearwood, someone who I've known for quite some time, who's done tremendous work in communities that are underrepresented and underserved. So I'm pretty excited about this opportunity to bring those skills into a space that is needed, especially in light of when we see that women of color, especially Black women, continue to make far less than our white male counterparts in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. All three of those things are critically important in the workplace, especially in city government. And so I did want to start with both Nicole and Ngozi to just understand, and this is also in the lens, Nicole, of what you were talking about in terms of women being critical in the role. And as a mom, and seeing women and individuals coming back to work right now as we reopen from COVID, I know certain type of work dynamics may be a bit more challenging, especially with the exposure, you're in, you're out, and that type of thing. And so have you both given any thought to retention of women of color in leadership, like in terms of strategies for that? Also, not just women of color, but also specifically moms as well, because oftentimes we find that, women are cornerstones of our community, and especially when you have children, it's just a different weight that is being carried in terms of the family structure.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Brooks Powers. And that's kind of why I raised the issue of the work from home being a challenge. One of the things that I've noticed in the trends, and as a member of, a sorority women's organization and serving on a commission that worked with the UN, understanding that globally, the pandemic impacted women more, especially mothers, because once schools closed, the caretaking of children fell on the mother, and this happened during the pandemic. So this is part of the reason why women were more impacted by the pandemic in the workplace, just for that reason, for being that person, being that caretaker, having to care for their children when schools closed. So that was the first thing. The second thing with that is why I would encourage, again, some sort of flexibility, because I think that people kind of got used to the flexibility of, working from home allows a little bit more space. As long as people are still being productive and getting the job done, getting the work done, I think that we can negotiate that so that the mother who has to care for her child, who may have to stay home because the school closed, they can still perform, have access to that employment, and still be able to take care of their children. So again, not having examined all the data yet, I definitely encourage flexibility and just understanding the complexity of those issues. And I think that this is not the first time in history that women have been impacted, by this type of thing. When anything happens, because we have that caretaking role, it shifts to us. And so I just think it's something that's important for the city to really consider, to again attract women. Women need to be at the table. Women need to be in these spaces, because all of our city agencies are tasked with serving everyone in the city. I just think about an example I saw recently, and this is again the importance of having that diversity and having people present. A nurse told a story, a Black woman nurse, and she said that they had a patient, they're on rotation, and another nurse almost recommended a patient for a psych evaluation because this particular patient, who was a Black woman, was patting her head like this. Now, as Black women, we know why somebody might be doing this, right? It could be just because someone is wearing hair extensions, a weave, or a wig. That's all. But because this person, who was not from that culture, She did not realize that this woman was simply patting her head because of her hairstyle. And she was literally about to put this person into a position where they would need a psych eval. And so these are the kinds of things that having women in the workplace, having women of color in the workplace, this is what we bring, those cultural understandings. So I would, again, definitely go for having those conversations around, we have to have some sort of flexibility because we need to be there. And also even having a mother's perspective in the workplace is also helpful. There could be things and issues that come up. As you know, I personally don't have children, but I do have nieces and nephews and some godchildren that I might understand, or that the person who has a child may have a deeper understanding of that I may not be considering. So it's all about having everyone present at the table, and especially in the workforce, in the workplace.
Thank you so much. In terms of the question, as I said earlier, I think that it's very important to have flexibility, but I also think it's important for employees to know that people see them. So recognizing that sometimes women, especially women of color, especially Black women, are stuck behind a glass ceiling, under a glass ceiling, as I guess it would be. I think it's important to ask people about their ambitions, because in doing that, you, one, say that there is a future, there are things for you here, and then also it gets people to think about what more they might be doing. Another thing that I would think of is to talk about to people, what do they think gets in the way of them achieving those ambitions? Because some of the things that we think might be getting in the way may not be the same as people perceive. And so understanding that that might not be possible on a one-on-one basis for the whole city workforce at the same time, I think there are ways that it can be possible. So for example, on my team, there are 10 of us working. I can't have a conversation, that type of conversation, with everyone regularly and still do the other things that I'm supposed to do. So then I've mandated that each employee meet quarterly with our chief of staff. And then that is someone who they can talk to about different things, get some ideas, say what their concerns are, talk about their goals, and then that can filter back to their supervisor or to me. So I think that there are ways that we can be creative, but it's really important to be in tune with what people want and to let them know that we see them and we think that there is more possibility for them, and to help train them as necessary to get to the next place, because again, that's about retention.
And I thank you both for that, you know, and the fact that you're thinking through that lens going into these roles, because, you know, things change. And so this is important to be able to retain and attract women of color, because I know there are, you know, women that have been considered for commissioner roles and things like that. But because of the lack of flexibility with the city, we have lost out on some great talent. And lastly, I'd like to just pivot over to Ms. Hume. Similar to the speaker, we share a neighboring district, and, you know, we see quite a bit of land use exercises happening in our district. So I would like to understand a little bit more granular in terms of how you see in your role working with the council members. So I know the speaker focused on the community board, which is really important too, and the members of the community, but I'm interested in also understanding how you would engage with the council members in your role. And then I would like to know your thoughts on development as it relates to global warming. And why I ask that is because I represent the 31st Council District, which a part of that district is a coastal community. We have significant upzoning that has taken place there and development underway there right now. And I never really hear city planning talking about evacuation routes. When you start to change the footprint of a community, especially a coastal community, what that entail does to the resiliency of the community, the ability to evacuate, especially in light of Superstorm Sandy. So I'd like to know your thoughts around that too. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. As far as how to engage or how I can engage with council members and the community, to be honest, I'm not even clear how frequently that's meant to happen per application or per case, but I am looking very much forward to meeting council members and discussing the concerns of that community as applications come up. As for my feelings about how we should build and think about impacts of global warming on new development and existing communities, and of course, I feel quite strongly that we need to make a number of changes, and New York City, thankfully, has been quite aggressive in adopting new energy codes and policies that help not just resiliency along the coast, but also the other things that impact our floodwaters and our temperature and all the other, our carbon footprint. And so thinking about it holistically, I believe that as we move towards electrification and renewable resources, in addition to considerations of immediate resiliency and long-term planning, I believe that we need to put those all at the very forefront of what we're doing. And again, I feel very fortunate to be a part of New York City, where some of those measures have already been codified in a way that's been much more progressive than some of our counterparts in other cities.
Thank you.
Thank you. And before we move forward, we have a tour from the new School of the New York Times, I think, visiting us today. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're going to now move over to Councilmember Brewer, and we'll be followed by Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you very much. Obviously, the BSA, for those of us in the community, is not a pleasant experience when we end up there, to be honest with you, because we are always on the, feeling that the BSA is going to rule against the local community. It's just a general, that's why I think you're getting these kinds of questions. So I'm not going to repeat them, but are there other ways, either through technology, which you mentioned in the questions, or in your past and working in the private sector, where more creatively we could explain to the community what is going on, or where you think there's more planning for land use in the city of New York, which is what some of us would like to see, that we wouldn't end up with some of these really hard decisions. So, a more general philosophical question. The BSA, when I go there, I'm like, and I've been there hundreds of times on behalf of the community, and it's a horrible experience, to be honest with you, because you feel you're going to lose, and you feel like it's a waste of time, and you want to just go to Article 78 immediately. So I guess I'm asking, just thinking, in 2022, 2023, how can we think about some of these issues a little differently? Thank you.
I appreciate the question and the honesty about the experience, and I have heard some similar testimony about appearing before the BSA. Philosophically, or as a broader question, of course, increasing access points and even just user friendliness to what the BSA is and how it makes its votes and what it deliberates over, I think is very important to get a better understanding for the community and for the public. I cannot speak to any kind of broader strokes of how we would move forward. It's very premature for me to make such a judgment, but I do hear what you're saying, and I am very excited to take all of that into consideration as we move forward.
Okay, we now go to Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to congratulate all the panelists on getting to this level, so congratulations on your nominations. My question is just to follow up on the BSA questions. I'm a former district manager before I became a council member. One of the things that I disliked the most is when I got mail from the BSA in the community board meeting, in my community board office, because I knew that regardless of what recommendations my community board had, they were going to be ignored because the BSA was just going to approve the applications. I know that you've been asked these questions, but I'm going to ask again. As a commissioner, what role are you going to play in ensuring that communities have access to number one, the meetings that you're having, and number two, that their voices are actually being heard when these variance applications are before you?
Of course, with the actual access to the hearings, right now, as I understand it, it is completely hybrid, as we are doing here. And I believe that the hybridization due to the pandemic has actually had the positive benefit of increasing access for people to attend the hearings live. Also, there is access to all of the video footage on YouTube, which increases that ability even if you're not able to attend in person or live via some remote call-in. You're able to access all the deliberation that happens prior to the following day's judgments.
As a BSA commissioner, when you are going to determine or vote, how do we know that your vote is going to be in line with recommendations from the local electeds, community boards, and community members?
It's impossible for me to commit to any alignment when I have to review a case on its specific basis. But of course, the community recommendation has to be factored into the decision that is made and the discretion that's used by each of the commissioners.
You know, the BSA has a reputation for being too lenient when applications come before them. And so I remember Councilmember Brewer was borough president. A few years back, we had then Councilmember Margaret Chin, and there was an application in front of the BSA, 2 bridges. And the applicant wanted to double the size of the development, and the BSA said it was a minor modification. I don't know how doubling the size of I don't want to call it a skyscraper, but a huge development, that's considered a minor modification. How would you have voted?
It's impossible for me to make an opinion on a case that I'm unfamiliar with.
Do you not think that doubling the size of a development is not a minor modification, and it should have been gone in front of a land use, a ULURP application?
The way you're describing it, it sounds egregious, but I have no facts. I have no context in which to make an opinion about that. I do believe the BSA has some ability to help shape the final outcome of the application. And ideally, all of the components that go into the application, including community recommendations, are factored into how we help shape the ultimate approved application if it is approved.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to ask my questions.
Thank you. I don't believe we have any other questions on. Oh, we have one from Councilmember Sanchez.
No, thank you, Chair. So my first question will be for Ms. Yoon. So Ms. Yoon, first, how did you come to be appointed to the BSA?
I haven't been appointed yet. I'm hoping that, anyway, I haven't been appointed yet, yes, but I was nominated by the vice chair of the BSA, Shampa Chanda, Commissioner Shampa Chanda.
Okay, thank you. And then second, can you tell us a little bit about your philosophy, right? Of course, there's going to be standards and rules and laws and all of that you're going to be looking at as you consider the specific facts of an application before the BSA. But what is your philosophy? What are your priorities? Are there any projects that are, should be considered differently than others? Perhaps Councilmember Brooks Powers asked about climate resilience. You have a background in affordable housing. Are there any specific philosophical sort of and just priorities that you have coming in as a commissioner that you would have coming in as a commissioner?
As you mentioned, I've already described a couple of priorities that I have as a person. As an objective commissioner who needs to remain unbiased in reviewing applications, I hope to keep that objectivity, of course, always keeping in mind the idea of the positive evolution of the city and the context around that certain application.
Thank you. And then for our EEPC candidates, Ms. Yearwood and Ms. Socorro, you've gotten a number of questions from my colleagues on this front. I feel this is
Councilor, they've actually left. The EEPC candidates have left.
Well, then I will maybe share this at a different forum. Okay, never mind. Thank you. I can't totally see who's there. But thank you then, Chair. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember. Without any other questions, we will now move on to the City Planning Commission. Thank you for your testimony and answering questions. So let me give you 1 second. And you're excused if you would like to leave.
Thank you again, Councilman.
Thank you. We're going to now move to City Planning Commission. Just a little bit of background on City Planning Commission. Pursuant to the New York City Charter, the City Planning Commission must consist of 13 members with 7 appointments, which includes appointments of the chair made by the mayor, 1 appointment each made by the public advocate, and each borough president. All members except the chair are subject to the advice and consent of the City Council. According to the charter, the members should be chosen for their independence, integrity, and civic commitment. CPC members other than the chair are not considered regular city employees, and there's no limitation on the number of terms that a member may serve. However, members are prohibited from holding any other city office while serving on the CPC. CPC has a number of responsibilities, including engaging in planning focused on the city's orderly growth, improvement, and future development, which should involve considerations concerning appropriate resources for housing, business, industry, recreation, and culture, overseeing and coordinating environmental reviews mandated by the state's environmental conservation law, preparing required reports. They also establish various rules consisting of establishing minimum standards for certifying ULURP applications and establishing criteria associated with the selection of sites for capital projects. The member who is designated as vice chair receives an annual salary of $73,855. The other members receive an annual salary of $64,224. We now have 3 candidates before us today. We have Resma Kermani-Fry, Professor Osorios, and Mr. Gold. Would you all please raise your right hand to be sworn in?
Do you all swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You can proceed.
Thank you. We'll allow all you to make an opening statement. We can start over here and move down. Thanks.
If it's okay with everyone, I'll take my mask off. Good morning, and thank you, Chair Powers and Speaker Adams, and honorable committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. I'm happy to be considered for the City Planning Commission. There we go. Sorry about that. By way of background, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I've lived in 3 of the 5 boroughs, with my formative years spent on Staten Island and then in Brooklyn. I'm an attorney admitted to practice for 25 years. I completed college and law school, a 7-year program in just over 4 years. I was extremely driven and motivated, though, by necessity. My family struggled after the death of my father when I was 11, following a 7-year bout with a terminal, debilitating illness. The emotional toll on my mom and my family was huge. The medical bills also wiped us out financially, though, and led to several housing challenges. In fact, I started working weekends and summers at the age of 11, doing odds and ends and helping on a construction site to help pay the bills. So I know how it feels to make tough decisions with limited funds while facing foreclosure. But before my father became ill, both he and my mother were civil servants. They worked in the Richmond County Borough President's office and for members of the City Council. I grew up going to work with my parents, who were early proponents of affordable housing for both low and moderate income families. And these were ideals that I learned at a very early age. In 1985, at a dedication for low-income housing development, in fact, Mayor Koch said about my dad's involvement, "Public service is the noblest of professions if it's done honestly and if it's done well." He does it honestly and he does it superbly. The reason I tell you all of this is because my experiences at a young age really helped shape my life and are responsible in large part for my success. Professionally, I spent nearly 20 years evaluating companies' strategic challenges, providing problem-solving advice, and doing research for some of the sharpest economic minds. For the last 7 years, I've served on the board of a New York City-based bank, helping small businesses grow and helping to fund a variety of real estate projects, both residential and commercial. So I understand what it takes to make a project work financially. But at the same time, I've done pro bono work for military personnel and veterans, helping them prepare their affairs and stave off foreclosure. I will never forget the soldier who came to us for help when his home was illegally foreclosed while he was overseas fighting for our country. I also work closely with the dependents of first responders killed or injured in the line of duty, and as you can imagine, housing becomes a primary concern of a household after losing their breadwinner. While I've been able to help on a one-on-one basis, joining the City Planning Commission positions me to take a more systemic approach. Affordable housing is the #1 challenge for New York City and where I can make a meaningful impact and better support vulnerable populations. My life experience, combined with legal, financial, and economic training, give me a unique perspective that I can utilize to bolster the invaluable work of the City Planning Commission. First, my pro bono work related to foreclosure prevention for veterans and others has given me a firsthand look at the housing challenges that persist across the city. Losing your home is extremely scary, with significant long-term effects on the entire family. Second, with over 2 decades of service on nonprofit and for-profit boards, I've learned to look at challenges from multiple angles, balancing the needs of various constituencies while building consensus. As a result, my insight into the cost and impact of real estate development, residential and commercial, has grown exponentially. But finally, I'm extremely interested in helping advance the growth of New York City by ensuring our infrastructure can support increasing access to affordable housing, transportation, and critical services. I know we have some challenges ahead, but I also believe there's no other place with the energy or potential of New York City. We have significant need for additional affordable housing, but we also have amazing opportunities with the Mayor's City of Yes initiatives. I believe the partnership between the Mayor, the Council, and the City Planning Commission can bolster the leadership position of our city at a time when there are many who think New York has lost its edge. And I deeply want to help facilitate the balanced, equitable growth of our city and ensure its success. Thank you for the time today, and I'm now available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. We'll do testimony from all three and then ask questions.
Thank you, Chair Powers, Speaker Adams, and honorable council and committee members. So for context and background, I've lived in Brooklyn for 27 years, from Windsor Terrace to Sunset Park, Brownsville to Fort Greene, and now in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I have an 11-year-old son, Kabir, who's here with me today. Councilmember Hudson, you recently spoke at his PS11 graduation, and he wanted to see what you did in real life. So I was born and raised outside of Boston in a close-knit, extended Pakistani family and community. And in terms of family, it was amazing. But I always knew since about Kabir's age that I wanted to live in New York City, a city where I knew I would experience belonging, instead of mostly feeling like an outsider. And that's been 100% true. The process of planning the city's infrastructure and strengthening neighborhoods has always fascinated me. My undergraduate thesis was about the transformation of Soho from an industrial sector to a community where art and land use became part of a social movement in the 60s. So this feels like a very full circle moment for me. I've spent almost 30 years deeply embedded in work that invests in New York City communities and the people who live in them. My first job, the summer between my junior and senior years in college, was running an SYEP program in Sarah D. Roosevelt Park with University Settlement. This was in '94, and the transformation of that park was just the beginning. Young people from the community built a children's garden that summer and helped to organize the first ever Sarah D. Roosevelt Park Festival with their community. After college in '95, I worked at the then fledgling Times Square Business Improvement District, and I learned so much about changing the narrative of a place, the power of zoning and community engagement, the power of corporations, and kind of my first peek into what public-private partnerships can do. My next job was as the first Brooklyn Outreach Coordinator for another startup organization called Partnerships for Parks. And I got to know the 432 at the time parks and playgrounds in Brooklyn, the communities, residents, how the Parks Department works, the challenge with interagency projects, the vital role of the City Council. I learned about the importance of space and place to communities, and that deep engagement that values communities and their expertise is so crucial to land use decisions. I was a founding member of the Brownsville Partnership team in 2008 with the unofficial official mayor of Brownsville, Greg Jocko Jackson, who has since passed and is the greatest mentor, teacher, and friend that I've ever had. The Brownsville Partnership evolved into a network of over 24 organizations working together with residents to build on the assets of Brownsville. And what I learned in Brownsville, what I've learned everywhere I've worked, was to listen and then to bring together residents, government, organizations, and other stakeholders to lean all the way in, moving past discomfort, to imagine and help realize a neighborhood shaped by the people who live there. I think it came as a surprise to many people that I left Brownsville in 2015 to join the executive team at the New York City Housing Authority as the director of the Office of Public-Private Partnerships. Besides the connection to the Parks Department, I'd never worked in government before, but it was a relatively simple decision, actually. Brownsville has a high concentration of public housing, and after seeking counsel and guidance from many Brownsville residents, I reached out and was offered this position. Public housing, as we all know, is the most affordable housing in New York City. Public housing residents work overwhelmingly in jobs that keep the city moving. But so often we don't value public housing the way we value other types of affordable housing. After coming from a career in community organizing, nonprofit management, working at NYCHA was certainly different, and it's one of the best decisions I've ever made. Many of the same strategies that I use to build trust in communities, one-on-ones, deep listening, and learning with residents, some ideation, and certainly credibility building with partners were great tools in breaking through, if you will, the intense bureaucracy and hierarchy at NYCHA. My role was to increase NYCHA's external relationships and partnerships. I created and led an independent nonprofit organization to serve as NYCHA's kind of innovation escape hatch. I was the founding president of the Fund for Public Housing, an independent 501c3 organization that still exists, of course, and invests in public housing residents and communities to improve the way public housing works. Then, as an independent consultant, I've continued to work with incredible organizations, communities, government stakeholders, all committed to the equitable growth and development of New York City. Today, New York City is at a crossroads of epic proportions, as we all know. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the deep inequities that face our city, demanding a reckoning and deep change. Mayor Adams has put forth a bold and inclusive vision for growth for our incredible city. The plan will require that DCP and CPC to center neighborhoods through equitable and imaginative planning across our city, that we partner early and often with the City Council, that deep community engagement moves beyond public hearings. We must respond with a commitment to planning efforts that supports inclusive transformation, such as last year's passage of the racial impact study legislation. In terms of housing, supply absolutely matters. Empirical research shows that the supply and demand issue is very real and that adding supply is incredibly important as part of the solution to the problem. Every neighborhood needs to contribute in order to solve the housing crisis. And while we need all types of housing, including market rate housing, the city is in desperate need of deeply affordable housing. Marginalized communities and people are suffering the most right now, and every New Yorker deserves a safe and affordable place to live. Mandatory inclusionary housing, a tool the council passed and is a national model for cities, is essential in holding developers accountable to creating affordable units, but it's not enough. It must be maximized in every community. The ULURP process and the rezonings that will emerge take years. It's critical that the mayor, council, community boards, communities, DPC, and CPC work together to speed up the process of creating deeply affordable housing. It will take all of us to creatively reshape policies and protocols, but we can do this together. So in closing, let me say this. I moved to Brooklyn 27 years ago, and I've spent, as I said, my career working in or on behalf of New York City communities. The intersection of the physical environment, health, socioeconomic issues, housing, deep engagement, and more. I'm a connector, and I value and get immense joy from relationships above all else. I'm so looking forward to working with the City Council, with all of you. We are partners in the work. We can't do it alone. ensuring an inclusive and equitable growth strategy so that all New Yorkers can thrive. And at the end of the day, it is the people, the communities, neighborhoods who are the greatest asset in the city of New York. It's the residents of New York City that we are all accountable to. We are in this together and will benefit from a deep and committed relationship of trust and collaboration. I'm excited for what we'll do together to support equitable growth, and it will really be my honor to serve on the CPC and serve the people of our great city. So thank you so much, and I'm of course open to any questions.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the City Council's Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections, as I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss my nomination by the Brooklyn Borough President, Antonio Reynoso, to serve on the City Planning Commission. Building on 16 years of professional planning work, I'm eager to activate my perspective as an architect and urban planner to help guarantee critical and objective planning and decision-making. I bring my experience providing technical assistance to community-based planners, conducting environmental justice research and advocacy, and advancing climate change mitigation and adaptation planning. I know firsthand how important the CPC is in guaranteeing a rigorous evaluation of proposals, and have always seen it as a critical space in which to debate public concerns, respond to community needs and priorities, and inspire a dialogue that guides decisions toward achieving the greatest public good. As an academic researcher, my work is focused on conducting scientific investigations to tackle the complexity of the issues affecting cities like New York and design innovative ways to respond with ethical and political commitment. I've learned to ensure that planning includes both comprehensive and strategic initiatives to address structural and procedural conflicts between local community priorities with citywide goals. This includes, for example, ensuring that planning proposals geared to accelerate climate action or build community resiliency also address environmental justice issues in communities that have historically experienced a disproportionate environmental burden from infrastructure utilities and noxious land uses. In nominating me, the Brooklyn Borough President and his staff have shown they trust my perspective on planning issues, granting me the autonomy I need to exercise sound, independent judgment. I see myself representing the entire borough of Brooklyn, which includes all the individual communities whose voices need to be amplified in the context of citywide planning priorities. Otherwise, efforts to address the overlapping crisis of housing availability and affordability, poverty, public health, and climate change can lead to further displacement and/or concentrate or reproduce inequality. The New York City Charter mandates that the CPC lead the evaluation of research to guarantee a comprehensive analysis of projects' impacts at all stages of the planning process. Per the City Council's recent legislative initiatives, the CPC is uniquely positioned to oversee detailed investigations on the impacts of rezonings on racial equity, but also to apply lessons learned from the intended and unintended effects of previous planning actions and making any needed corrections to ensure the effectiveness and integrity of future decision-making. But in addition, the CPC can and should initiate its own plans. This is not limited to land use policy in and of itself, or strictly confined within the built environment, but rather to embrace the opportunities and implications of land use decisions on larger domains, such as economic development, physical, social, and mental well-being, ecological sustainability, and environmental justice, to name a few. These are ambitious undertakings that no single body can accomplish alone. If appointed, I would be honored to join Chair Garodnick and other commissioners in partnering with the City Council to rebuild trust on the land use planning process and strengthen the leadership of the CPC. Thank you for considering my nomination. I would be happy to address any questions from the committee.
Thank you. We'll now move into questions for the nominees. I'll start with our speaker, Adrienne Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my time here in this hearing is limited, so I'm just going to ask one question for the three of you, and I apologize in advance if I probably won't be able to hear all three answers. While most of the recent attention in the planning community has focused on affordable housing, I know that we here in the council have certainly focused, and that is our utmost priority, at least one of them. There are still so many other areas in need that have to be addressed. One, of course, being the economy. Where do you see potential areas of growth or areas that can be developed in New York City's economy that can keep us competitive in the 21st century? And we can start with Mr. Gold.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Economically speaking, generally, of late, fintech has been, particularly financial technology, has been particularly sought after, and New York has the talent and the resources. And that, to me, is an area where I think we need to spend some more time. We've started to actually build, many of the areas have started to build here in the city, and I think we have the talent, and I think we have the ability. So it's one of the areas that I think actually would be quite good.
Thank you so much for the question. I think, and as you heard, that it's incredibly important that community engagement is at the core of kind of any decision-making in planning, whether it be housing or economic development. And every neighborhood is different. And the assets can be viewed so differently by the people who live there, where they're kind of creating the narrative, where so often the external narrative of a place is created by external people. So there are likely areas of growth in terms of economic development if we ask folks what they're interested in and also what the land can be used for, or buildings or infrastructure that could feed into economic development and equitable economic development. So I'm always gonna say, like, let's go and ask people and then see where those connections and inroads can be made based on what people want and what works for our city. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm very excited about it. I think that we are at a historic moment where we're about to have the opportunity to attract hundreds of thousands of jobs to New York City that are going to be resulting from the accomplishment or the fulfillment, the implementation of state climate change legislation. The CLCPA is going to require that we activate New York City, all sectors of the economy, to be able to cater to the adaptation economy. All the different services and goods that will be required to update the entire building stock, not to mention the improvement of public infrastructure across the 5 boroughs. I'm specifically excited about the question because I served in the land use. I was appointed by the governor to serve in the land use and local government advisory panel for the implementation of the CLCPA, and I currently serve in the advisory council convened by the city for offshore wind. But in order to do that, we need to plan. And the CPC is uniquely positioned to guarantee that we align our different policies to make that happen. First and foremost, that we protect land that is zoned for industrial uses, because otherwise we're going to lose that opportunity to manufacture these goods and services forever. We have existing tools to do that. The Waterfront Revitalization Program, to name one, and a historic undertaking of the Department of City Planning, provides the tools to ensure that projects and proposals are consistent with long-term planning policies to attract the type of infrastructure projects that will allow us to preserve manufacturing, particularly along the waterfront. But in addition to that, all of our planning decisions should be geared to creating a workforce, increasing access, particularly for low-income and communities of color, to be able to take advantage of these jobs, so that the economic development that can derive from this can serve as a form of reparation in places with climate change has had a historic disproportionate impact in New York City.
Thank you. I have a round of questions, but I know I have a few members who need to run, so I'm going to first go to Councilmember Brooks Powers, Councilmember Borelli, and Councilmember Hudson, Councilmember Brewer, and then I'll come back.
Thank you for that. So I know that the buzz statement is about affordable housing these days, and it's often when we talk about affordable housing that we talk about rental. And I'm interested in understanding the vision around helping families, especially low-income families and communities of color, to be able to get a stake in the game and build generational wealth. I think that a part of housing dignity is giving people that opportunity to that American dream, and that is of homeownership. And I also have found in my short time in the council, a little over a year, in the land use applications that have come before the council and really directly in my district, there have been a number of unintended consequences is what I like to call it, because I couldn't imagine that this was intentional, but we saw the zoning changes that led to a lot of hotels coming in areas that have no tourist attractions that were converted into shelters. Also brick and mortar shelters. So my district is one of the districts in Queens, I think is the second, if not the first, most populated in terms of sheltering systems. Through the zoning process, it has allowed organizations and entities to be able to build those as opposed to creating opportunities for home ownership. And so that's an ongoing concern. And then what I often find is that there's been a lack of vision with development in terms of looking at it more holistically. So the infrastructure, the roads, the evacuation route, no one in the city planning team has at all brought up evacuation routes as we look at zoning plans. Health infrastructure. So, these are just to name a few areas that are critical but not really discussed. And so in your role, I would love to have a commitment that you would be more intentional and taking into account the community circumstances. And I was so happy to hear you say all communities are not the same, because they truly are not. And as you heard me say earlier to Ms. Yoon, I represent a coastal community, and so we cannot be viewed in the same lens. And as much as my community wants to be a part of a citywide conversation to address the housing crisis, we can't shoulder the burden the same way on a peninsula, a geographically isolated piece of land. And so I would really like to hear that commitment from each of you. I would also like to understand what, through your own individual experiences, are you bringing to the table to be able to tackle some of the things I spoke to, particularly the need for more affordable homeownership, creating more opportunities for generational wealth, especially Black generational wealth. I was happy when in the presidential election it was starting to be discussed. Nothing really came out of it since then, but I would love to hear how you see leveraging these roles to creating that path, and then also how you what you see as ways to mitigate unintentional consequences through city planning and zoning plans for the city. Thank you.
So first, thank you for the question. Speaking on both generational wealth and homeownership, to me, so I've spent a lot of my life staving off foreclosure for folks who were in over their head. And that happens for a couple of reasons, but coming back to the root of it, when I think about the project that I mentioned in my opening statement that my dad was a champion of many years ago, it was a project that was made for low and moderate income to be able to actually get home ownership. It was a federally funded program. It was in partnership with our federal government partners. And the concept was to basically make it so that instead of renting, folks could get the keys and have their own home. And that was really the start of it. Now, as I did a lot more research over certainly the past few years, at some point, unfortunately, the federal partners didn't come in as heavily as they should have, and so what ended up happening was it was shifted to essentially a rental community, a rental project. But the concept, I think, very much works. It's just I do think we need help from our federal partners. We need, especially in this environment, an ability to provide low mortgage rates. Mortgage rates are a problem right now for everyone. They've really actually tripled, as I understand it, in the past few months. But let's go one step further. It's not just the mortgage, it's the ability to navigate, to be able to purchase that first home. And everyone has to start somewhere. In my personal experience, as I say, I've been involved with the bank, and we actually have a program that goes out and teaches in the schools. It teaches how to manage money and how to start to save up for that down payment, but also what the resources are that are out there that basically can help you get there. Because it's, as I'm sure you know, it's not an easy process, right? It's not an easy process to both you need the capital, but also the ability to get a mortgage is a difficult process, and it's just gotten a lot harder. And so I think there's a lot there. I think that we do need help from our partners, some of the other agencies, and also our federal partners to help there. And then to the second question, I do believe that every community is different, and I do believe that every community should have their input and have to be looked at with a lens. I think the commission's role, as I see it, is to put on that citywide lens. So, you're absolutely right that there need to be some protections from the commission for different areas, for sure. But obviously taken in balance, right? I mean, every area, I think about it as my 3 children. Each child has a different need, and you need to have that community engagement and understand from both the community and the council what the issues are.
Thank you for the questions. I'm going to start with a little bit of my personal history. So, and be totally open and honest, right? I'm 49 years old. I've forever rented. I'm a renter now. And it's, in some periods of time, that's been a really great thing. Other periods of time, it's a really, really hard thing. But a huge barrier for me has been the down payment. And this, I think, is true for so many people. And so many New Yorkers, particularly low-income New Yorkers of color, also navigating that process, who gets loans, who doesn't. I don't come from a family that I can say, hey, can you help me out with a down payment? We were figuring out how are we going to pay off college loans, right? Like that took the priority. And so, my mom bought a house in her 50s. My parents are divorced, but they're like BFFs. It's fantastic. And my dad, too, in his 60s, bought a home, right? It wasn't like they got married, bought a house, had a kid, and followed that path of generational wealth building. And when my mom, who has very severe Alzheimer's, her care became, of course, a priority. And when I sold her house, what we decided as a family was that money would go to pay off education debt, right? That was the decision, and the decision of certainly of my mom prior to her illness. And so again, I'm a great renter, right? Like I pay my rent. I would be a great homeowner, and so would many, many, many New Yorkers. And I will be completely honest with you. So sometimes it's like, I don't know how I'm going to get there. And it's not, and I think and I'm somebody with a graduate school degree, have had consistent employment, and I'm constantly aware of, like, if that's my experience, what's the experience like for people who are low income? I mean, I talk about this with people all the time. And so what are we doing to make that easier or change the system? So I just wanted to bring a little bit of my experience, personal experience, and the frustration. I mean, I think I go through periods of where I'm like, it's okay, I can be a renter for the rest of my life. Like, that's okay. It's not, and then I think about Kabir, I think about like, okay, but like, what are we doing? What am I doing? So it's stressful and frustrating. And like, what are we collectively, what can we do to shift that? In terms of the uniqueness of every community, And as much as each neighborhood is unique with a unique set of needs and infrastructure, as you said, like from housing to transit to coastal issues and resiliency to arts and culture and health and education, how are we taking like a citywide perspective so that no single community is overburdened? I think that's a really important question to ask. I don't know that I have an answer, but it's incredibly important to me that every community and neighborhood is contributing to the growth and development of New York City, but that we examine what communities are overburdened in what way. And then that leads to your question about unintended consequences. And again, I go back to what was the community recommended? What was the deep engagement? Did it happen? Were there those contact points with residents, with communities, and then how was that listened to and applied? Because unintended consequences, and I so appreciate you saying that, how do we make unintended consequences not intended consequences? And I think we do that with deep, honest engagement and then communication and partnership between CPC, City Council, and communities. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your questions. I think that this is a really exciting opportunity to discuss the connection between some of the topics that you raised. Affordable housing experts have been advocating for decades for a combined approach to new housing development with preservation efforts through a comprehensive strategy. In other words, that building new units is not enough. We really need to address homelessness, prevent displacement, encourage home ownership, as you mentioned, but also prevent tenants' rights and rent regulation, improve vulnerable living conditions to secure safety, and address environmental justice and sustainability. And we need, in order to do that, we need a central planning muscle that is thinking in that direction. We also need a city that is investing in public infrastructure to achieve the public good. And I think that we can also take advantage of the tools provided by the solidarity economy and economic democracy to not just aim to increase local employment, but as you said, increase local wealth. And I'm talking about community land trusts that can extend the ownership and the control of local communities over land, over infrastructure, over the economy, as well as worker-owned cooperatives that can engage New Yorkers, particularly from low-income and communities of color, in developing the skills that will be required to take advantage of the hundreds of thousands of jobs that the CLCPA and other legislation is going to bring to New York. Otherwise, they're going to go somewhere else. This is all about planning. And I think that the CPC is uniquely positioned to do that. But in order to do that, we need to combine the local capacity to plan with comprehensive planning. And in order to do that, I think that long-term comprehensive planning and the local capacity to plan need to work in tandem to address imbalances between local priorities and citywide goals. But we can do that by enforcing legislative initiatives that have already been introduced and passed by this city council. I'm going to focus on two concrete opportunities where I see the CPC taking a leading role in this. Number one, in ensuring that the investigation of the unintended and intended and unintended impacts of planning actions in communities are actually achieving its goals, and to what extent they're actually resulting in forced displacement. I think that doing that is the first step. The second step should reflect the lessons learned in updating the tools that the City Planning Commission uses for the review of proposals to make sure that we improve the calculations and the projections made to make sure that we strengthen future decision making, which is the second part. And the second point that I wanted to make has to do with taking advantage of some of the tools I can think of at least 4 different tools that have been created following legislation from the City Council that are currently disconnected. So going back to the monitoring of the impacts of planning actions, I want to point out how important it would be to have a tool that can overlay the data that has recently made available showing potential risk to displacement with the rezonings tracker that shows the actual rezonings, the areas that have been rezoned, and the commitments that are in place to make sure that as we monitor the impacts of the rezonings on displacement, we can ensure whether or not the commitments have been made. Right now, these are 2 separate tools that do not allow the public to see them in context. And I think that the other thing that I wanted to point out in terms of the other 2 tools have to do with connecting the risk of displacement with rezoning and other planning interventions with climate change. Right now, the tools that have been provided to track coastal flooding vulnerability or heat vulnerability, which are 2 different disconnected tools, should be interconnected to be able to see, again, the risk of displacement, current rezonings, and rezoning commitments with the vulnerability to climate change. And I mention this because if we don't do that, we're not just facing potential threats from forced displacement in the form of gentrification, but experience a new type of potential threats in the form of environmental and climate gentrification. One last thing that I wanted to say in terms of the personal connection that you raised is that I am accountable to the communities that rely on solid, rigorous research at the CPC. And I believe that the CPC can be activated to do that. But in addition, it could recognize local priorities that have been recognized by the city charter through Section 197A, the 197A plans, 13 of them, which is a very little number, adopted over the last 3 decades by the CPC, that should be used our policy to guide decision-making and are currently being ignored. I think that the expertise of the CPC could be activated to provide technical, in partnership with the Department of City Planning, of course, to provide technical assistance to community boards in planning for their future, who should be engaged at all phases in the process, not just have an advisory role in making decisions to determine what type of growth, what type of housing should be developed in their communities, where and when. Thank you.
Can I just say I have a very deep appreciation for your response just now. So I do want to say thank you for that in terms of looking at it through or proposing that the commission look at it through a much more targeted and strategic lens. And I would love to see something like that implemented. And I also want to say that when we look at the citywide view, right, it's important when we look in communities to also do like that bird's eye view, because sometimes we may be focused on particular lots to upzone, but then we have to think about what's happening surrounding those properties. And in terms of housing, the one thing I didn't hear, which I would love to see in city, I'm wrapping it up now, that I would like to see is that just like we are making housing available for rental, what I'm hearing from people who are also low income is that they cannot find housing that's affordable enough to purchase. And so the same way that we leverage these different mechanisms in terms of funding streams, we need to prioritize affordable homeownership opportunities. So I will end with that, and I thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from Councilmember Borelli, followed by Councilmember Hudson.
Thank you. Can you all just individually summarize your thoughts on single-family home zoning and whether you think there's an appropriate place for it in New York City?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, thanks for the question. So I do think that there's a place for it, and I believe that we are in need of like all types of housing in New York City. And I go back to what I've said before about what do communities want? And it's incredibly important to engage communities and listen to what communities want, and then figure out how to deliver on that. So that's my perspective, that communities are really unique, have unique needs, wants, desires. There's no uniform assumption, I don't think, that should be on the desires and needs and wants of communities. That deep engagement is really the answer. And then how do we respond to that?
So I'd follow that by saying, I do believe there's a place for single family, and essentially, I think the characteristic of the community is super important. It's not only what does the community want, but what does the community need based on the resources that are there, and it's really the characteristics. It's what fits, what are the community members used to, and what do they think is appropriate for the neighborhood, but I do believe there's a place.
Thank you for the question. I think that I very much understand the importance of recognizing and acknowledging the importance of single-family housing and zoning, in neighborhoods that rely on it. I think that oftentimes we make assumptions about who lives in these communities, and we tend to think that these are high-income communities and that there's privilege that is associated with it, and in many cases we're actually talking about working-class families that, as I said, require them, and that the affordability that we're trying to protect can be deeply threatened as soon as there's mapping initiatives to begin identifying underutilized land, or as soon as the Department of City Planning announces a rezoning study to understand the issues. This creates environments of speculation that can hurt them. I think that, as my colleagues have mentioned before, every community has specific needs, and I think that we need to be very careful about making these decisions, particularly in the lack of a comprehensive planning framework. But again, the CPC is uniquely positioned to partner with the City Council, again, building on legislation that you've introduced, to develop the methodologies, data-driven methodologies, to understand how do we actually make decisions to balance what the council member was talking about in terms of establishing, identifying conflicts, and addressing potential unbalances between local priorities and citywide goals. I do feel that every community has to contribute to accommodating growth, but that growth needs to happen in places where the infrastructure has been built. I think that accommodating growth or rezoning shouldn't be used.
Professor, you led into my next question, which is in areas of low density where there's an effort to rezone for higher density, should the rezoning come first, or should the infrastructure required to handle populations come first?
Thank you. I can answer that question first, if that's great with my colleagues. I believe that the infrastructure improvements need to be built first as a matter of principle, because we have to take into account histories of disinvestment, segregation, and other forms of discriminatory planning practices that have left several communities in New York City behind, places where the infrastructure used to exist but has been lost. And therefore, accommodating growth should not come to justify, or sorry, the need for the infrastructure shouldn't be used to justify the rezoning, but the infrastructure should be built and growth should be considered afterward. I also just want to say that it shouldn't be the city deciding where growth should go, but again, developing the local planning capacity so communities can decide what type of growth they want, where they want it, and when they want to build it.
Thank you for the question. I tend to agree with my colleague about infrastructure and looking at, the history of infrastructure investment. But we also know that rezonings historically have taken a really long time. And so are there aspects of rezonings that can happen in tandem? So it's not necessarily build the infrastructure, then think about the rezoning, because that could just extend the time really, really, really far, particularly for communities that don't have the infrastructure. And I think also really important is to look creatively at what is included in those rezonings and in development, and how we're creatively using space. And then again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I really, really mean it, what do communities want? What is that deep engagement from communities who are the experts on what they need and what they want, and how is that being incorporated? So I think it's less, well, certainly it's incredibly important that the infrastructure is there. I think it's less of a sequential, linear, completely linear process, and there can be overlap and should be overlap, and in the with an eye towards efficiency.
I'm just concerned because we're building some mass transit infrastructure now for 30 years, and we've seen development around there. So that my cautionary urging is that we do, in some ways, are stricter towards ensuring the infrastructure happens in a timely manner before we just allow development. But I'm sorry, Mr. Gold.
Thank you. So I guess I would preface my answer with the fact that I grew up on Staten Island waiting for that bus, and you never knew when it was coming. This was before the internet. And of course, I'm a little older, I think, than you are. And so also, and also waiting for the one train that we had out there. So I would agree that, I think it's an area by area decision. But, it really is a function of what the community is calling for, and, really what are the needs. In some areas, as you know, there are a lot more drivers right now by nature. They have to be there, but candidly, the infrastructure does have to be looked at and be figured out before you can overburden the roads.
Thank you.
Can I add something to my response?
Of course.
I just wanted to say that I don't think that we should increase growth just because we can. I think that there are places where we shouldn't be increasing density, and I want to emphasize places that are extremely vulnerable to coastal flooding, where infrastructure improvements can be created to, create that, as long as the private sector can afford it. But I don't think that that's good planning.
Thank you. We're going to go to Councilmember Hudson, followed by Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you. I just have two questions, one for Mr. Gold and then another for everyone. I'm just trying to, I guess, I'll just ask the question this way. You shared a lot about your personal upbringing and then obviously your professional path. And so I'm wondering, and I saw in your CV that you've refereed state foreclosure proceedings. And so I'm wondering, is your orientation to preventing foreclosures and keeping people in their homes, or is it to the opposite?
So thank you for the question. When I got involved refereeing foreclosures at the ESC of a judge on Staten Island to basically make sure the process was fair. And that's the referee's role on the foreclosure, is making sure, maybe now, and I can speak a little bit more about it, but basically making sure that everything is done properly, that the I's are dotted. And in many cases, as you may imagine, the paperwork gets sent back and it becomes a process where they do have to do the right thing. They basically have to have hearings and conferences with the homeowners. So actually, as I say, what brought me into the process was the request, and part of that was my life experience, both working with folks and actually personally my family being foreclosed when I was a young child. So it's something that as you can imagine, it's been a thread through my life.
Yeah, and I guess I was just trying to reconcile what you've shared as your personal experience with then your professional path.
Sure. So professionally, as I say, let me rewind for a second. So I graduated law school and went on to do two things. Professionally, I ended up taking a job at a small business, small bank, and I worked there for many years, up until a few years ago. But at the same time, I spent at varying times between 20 and 50% of my time doing nonprofit work and basically volunteering and helping, as I said, much of the time with the military veterans who were coming back overseas and had issues. Before they left, we helped them to put banks on notice that they couldn't touch their house and should stop the payments. And when they came back in the cases where the banks had not followed the law and hadn't listened and had foreclosed someone who was overseas who couldn't have been noticed, we stepped up to act to try to get those back and work on that. And then second, with the families of first responders, generally who are killed in the line of duty, some who are injured in the line of duty, but as you might imagine, often that's the breadwinner in the house. And the first challenge is, we are a family, we need to figure this out. And so some of that is actually asking, whether it's the landlord, whether it's the bank who holds the mortgage, to hold off, give us a little bit of time to figure this out, because this family really needs the help, and they're not of the mindset just yet that they can deal with this and, you know, figure it out. So.
Yeah, no, thank you, that's helpful. I would say then, based on that, your orientation is to keeping families in their homes.
So my personal orientation is to keeping people.
That's what I'm just trying to get to, your personal orientation.
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Very much so.
And then the question for all of you, and Mr. Osorio, you sort of referenced this in your testimony, but I just want to ask the three of you for the record, and particularly the two of you who are being appointed by the mayor. Do you feel, and have you been empowered to act independently and to vote based on how you believe you should be voting and not necessarily the way somebody else might want you to vote?
I can start by saying that yes, absolutely. In appointing me, the Brooklyn Borough President has recognized the autonomy that I require to make sound and independent judgment.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So yes, I'm very aware that I'm a mayoral designee, but I think part of the reason that I was nominated is because of me as an independent person. And I think, as you've heard and we've discussed, like, I really do feel empowered to make those independent decisions. And at the end of the day, for me, what is most important is working together in partnership, that equitable growth and development really means equitable growth and development across the city, that every neighborhood is contributing, every neighborhood is benefiting, that we are creating alignment, and that I weigh any recommendation in the context of what is best for the people of the city of New York and for communities. So I feel very empowered to make that statement and to carry that through in voting.
Thank you.
And I would say I definitely feel empowered to be independent. A couple of things. One, when this position first came up, I went to read the charter, and the word that stood out in my mind was integrity. The commissioners must, it's basically a key feature, characteristic in the charter. But second to that, just in my life, as I said, I've been on a number of boards, some nonprofit, one for-profit. And often, in many cases, I'm not the chairman. I'm a voice in the room, building and bridging consensus, if you will, and taking in the views of the different stakeholders and trying to come. And candidly, the chairman often has a big stick, if you might imagine. I have always shown my independence, and I think that's one of the reasons that I've been put forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll hear from Councilmember Brewer, followed by Councilmember Sanchez, and then I will do a round of questions.
Thank you very much. As Borough President, I think I did 200 ULURPs, so I have a sense more than the rest of the boroughs combined. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is pre-planning before you end up with a situation at the community board or even at the city planning, et cetera, planning. So I'm wondering what your positions, obviously it may not be for a single, but for every one of these rezonings. Some of them, obviously the one that Dan Garodnick and I did on East Midtown, it was a commercial, so it was easier, but pre-planning produced positive result. And so my question is, what's your position? We tried to get it into the charter and it was denied. into the charter revision proposal by then Mayor de Blasio. Number two is, do you think there are some aspects of the ULURP process that could be improved? Because you will be very much involved, as I have been for 8 years, and 12 years before that. So those are my two questions.
I can start. Thank you so much for your questions. I also just wanted to say that, Councilmember Brewer, when I came to New York to start working as an urban planner in 2006, I was greatly inspired by your leadership in fighting for democratizing data. I think that a lot of what I've said today and I've written in the documents that I've submitted are inspired by the opportunity to take control over the research and secure that these debates happen at the CPC. I think that one of the big opportunities that we have in front of us, which is not new, in fact, the effort that you co-facilitated with then Councilmember Reynoso as part of Inclusive City pointed this out. The CPC can be activated to, per the charter mandate in terms of providing guidelines for planning, take a stronger role in formalizing discussions that take place pre-certification process so that the public can know about them beyond the 30-day window that is now allowed, and formalize otherwise private agreements that are impossible to implement and to enforce. So that's one. Two, the CPC should oversee the analysis and research that the Department of City Planning does throughout the planning process, not just after proposals have been certified, which includes making sure that draft environmental impact statements are accurate and support the Department of City Planning in engaging with the developer in conversations to make sure that the quality and the accuracy of these studies is complete before ULURP starts. Another recommendation that Inclusive City has made. But perhaps the most important one, I think, has to do with really elevating the importance of the 197A plans. Because these are documents, as you know, that reflect decades of work in some cases that are being completely ignored and could actually be used as policy to inform and guide decision-making throughout the ULURP process, and where the CPC can actually take an important role in that. So in terms of changes to the ULURP process that I think could happen, I mean, I think that, of course, I would aim to change the city charter so that community boards can have a binding vote in the ULURP process. That is a much larger transformation, again, something that has been proposed for decades, but something very easy that we could do from the City Planning Commission is really acknowledge that these plans exist, use them, and elevate their contribution to land use review.
Thank you so much for the question. And I won't take time echoing so much of what my colleague said that I agree with. What I will say is that I think that my answer is similar to both questions on pre-planning and improvement on ULURP, which is they're both incredibly important, and I think that not enough residents and communities have access or know about what are the processes and what is involved and how can they be involved in either of those lanes, right? So ULURP, even if, like, there are lots of people that I've talked to where people have heard, but like, what is it, right? And so what is the initial, how can we improve, the CPC specifically, the initial communication on just what is it? What is it? What does the CPC do? What does the DCP do? And then again, for both questions, what is that deep engagement? As a member of the CPC, whether it's customary to do or not, like that really deep hanging out and being available in partnership with the city council, I think is incredibly important, to constantly have an open door. And how are we partnering so that folks are involved in both of those processes? That creates better planning. That creates better policies, protocols, and like better democratization, not just of data, but of processes.
So I would say a couple of things. One, earlier community involvement can only be a benefit. And candidly, as one looks at the ULURP process, yes, there are hearings. Yes, there are hearings at the community board level, but to someone's earlier question and answer, many folks either don't know about it or don't go to the community board hearings. And so having more and deeper community engagement, I think, is important at an early process, because I do think that many people feel that at the time they find out about it or see it or learn about it, the decisions have already been made. It's just way too late. And so I think that would be a spot where there is room there. And second, more broadly, it does feel to me, and maybe this is early, and you've looked at, as you said, about 200 of them, that the ULURP process or the pre-process is taking quite a while, and we do need the housing. So I think it's a balance. I think we need to have more engagement, earlier engagement, and that could actually potentially accelerate the process, because now the community has buy-in and interest, and working with the council members and working with the community, you get to a finished product that perhaps is much more both acceptable and fitting to the community, I think. So.
No, I mean, the problem with Manhattan is a different animal from the other boroughs, just completely different, because we're very built up. We deal with air rights. We don't know that they're being transferred. That's another discussion that we could have. Same thing with the lot mergers. Same thing with some of the mechanicals. So we've done all 197As. I don't know if there's anything left to do a 197A on. We could do them again, but they're not binding, so we know that. So I put a lot of time into improving the community boards. Not every borough president has done that, I'll be honest with you. So you need to have, giving them more power, which I am for, they have to be better appointed. So there's a lot of pieces, moving parts to all of this, but there's only one issue in New York City: real estate, real estate, and real estate. And so you have, if appointed and nominated and accepted, you have a really important job in front of you. Anne 11 was my appointment for 8 years, and I have to say she's the best. And there are some good people on now. But I congratulate you to getting this point, and have to say, of all the appointments, yours is the most important today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to go to Councilmember Sanchez, who I think is joining us on Zoom.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, Chair, and congratulations to all three of you on your appointment. So I just want to do a quick editorial note, because I know two of you, and I want to speak to that real quick. Razmia, I had the opportunity to work with Razmia while she was at NYCC, and was just always impressed with how much she centered resident voices and how much she really wanted to accomplish in that role while she was there. And I just want to appreciate you, and I know some of your previous work and where your intentions come from. And so congratulations on being here today. Recommend you to my colleagues. And Professor Osorio, it's so great to see you. To my colleagues, I would say that Juan Camilo is one of the most brilliant minds we have right now in New York City planning, in our generation. He's one of the most thoughtful planners that I've met, and I'm a planner. So I'm really glad that the borough president has appointed you to be on here, and that you're before us today. But I just wanted to start with those points and encourage my colleagues, that you both are really wonderful. Mr. Gold, haven't had the honor and the pleasure of meeting you just yet, but appreciate your responses today, and looking forward to getting to know you. So I just have one question. It's a sort of scenario-based question. The questions or the land use projects that come before you at the CPC are difficult, right? They're difficult choices. There's never a clear answer. It's always contextual. And so would you share with us here, what would drive your own decision making, which you have said that you feel could be independent, would be independent, no problem. But what would drive your decision making process in cases where serious priorities, big priorities conflict? So, for example, there isn't enough affordability on a project for what the neighborhood is asking for, but there would be green jobs created that pay well and are union and whatever. And the project itself, the development itself is a beautiful contextual project. Or on the flip side, there's a different project where it does reach deep affordability levels, but the community is asking for good jobs with benefits, and that's not a part of it, et cetera, right? Like there are a million ways that this all can go. Can you just talk to us about how you would weigh opposing priorities in these situations, and how we can, expect you to kind of navigate? So
First, thank you for the question, and unfortunately we haven't had the pleasure to meet just yet, but I look forward to that opportunity. As I think about it, community engagement and involvement is step one. So there are, to your point, if you had competing priorities, first it's what is the community saying? What is the community putting forward? What do they need? What are their needs? Second, as you think about that, there's involvement of our partners on the ground, which to me is city council, right? The city council person for the community also generally has a really good ear and a good eye and good knowledge. So if there are competing interests, I think about it as the community is first and should have the loudest voice, but with that, the council person, council member that they put forward also has really that just on the ground important knowledge to help bring it home. From a broader perspective, and say, of course, everything has to be looked at with a citywide lens. That's the job of the CPC, but the neighborhood to me speaks first, and the community involvement is just so important to the process. So I would put a lot of weight there.
Thank you for the question, and it's wonderful to see you, and congratulations in everything that is going on in your life. There are going to be competing priorities. It's such a complex, planning is, and this, is such a complex issue, even within communities, right, what the priority is. And you heard me say this before, my whole career has been about listening to communities and respecting that residents, the people who live and work in communities are the experts on what is important to them. They are planners. And bringing together sometimes unlikely stakeholders, sometimes folks who don't like each other, it's incredibly important that we do that to really get to what the priorities are for communities. So for me, community voice, community engagement, that's the most important thing. And then, I think if there are competing priorities, it's also about how do we take a goal and have that be the center rather than ego, rather than politics, how do we get everyone to work towards a goal? And there may be priorities that are sequential. So I think it's less about saying, this is the single priority and none of these other things matter, but what's the sequence in which other priorities can be woven in to the process? And being explicit and open about that. Is it about what resources can be leveraged first? Is it about incremental steps that can be made? And be explicit about it. Here are the goals, here are the deliverables, here's how we're going to meet them. But for me, absolutely, community voice, it's the most important thing. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Council Member, for your words. They mean a huge deal to me. Thank you so much for your question as well. It gives me the opportunity to emphasize one more time the importance of not having or to be able to create a comprehensive planning framework, to be able to do exactly what you just said. balance the conflicts, balance the imbalances between locally established priorities and citywide goals. If we had that, a data-driven methodology to be able to assess this and make the most out of the tools that we have, because they're not perfect. We make decisions based on calculations and projections, but we don't know the outcome. It is only now, thanks to recent legislation, that we'll be able to actually observe and measure and monitor the impacts of planning actions. But if the CPC, for example, doesn't take advantage of the current opportunity to use these reports and update the secret manual, update the tools that we have to make these projections, then we would be missing the opportunity. I think that this is another way of saying that we require local planning to be strengthened, which requires as an urgent priority, because if we have the comprehensive planning framework, but we don't have strong local planning capacity, then we're only halfway there. And then in strengthening the local capacity to plan, to articulate local visions and priorities, we need to provide technical assistance so that those plans are in place. And I'm not just talking about the community boards, but also acknowledging other types of community-based planners across all sectors of the city. I have mostly worked with the environmental justice movement, but these plans are everywhere. However, they're rarely consulted and oftentimes ignored. So having both in place is critical, but because the decisions shouldn't just be reacting to proposals that come from outside, but should actually be inspired and guided by the local priorities that have already been articulated. And in that, I want to say a few things about what the space that you allude to currently looks like. Right now, as colleagues mentioned, these hearings are just spaces where, people come and respond to proposals that are out there, but the CPC has the mandate to create a space for dialogue and really engage with public concerns and local priorities that are shared in these spaces to respond to them. And so engaging local communities in the process to evaluate the proposals and agree on the mechanisms that will be in place to secure that these projects or proposals are implemented and build equity, build justice toward achieving citywide goals is another potential activity of the CPC that, for example, should take advantage of the tools, as I mentioned earlier, but also should actively engage in making sure that as rezoning, as projects are implemented, that the evaluation of their impacts reflects back to, as I mentioned earlier, improve and continue to adjust the mechanisms that are used to make these decisions. Otherwise, I think that we're reviewing proposals one at a time and really losing track of the contribution that these actions are making toward achieving citywide goals in the context of local priorities.
All right, thank you so much. And just, I know this hearing has been going on for a while, but just, to comment that I want to appreciate how much you are all giving weight to community voice. But also we know that there's going to be times where community voice is one that's being an exclusionary community, one that is rejecting affordable housing, one that is rejecting, opportunities for others. And so there's always going to be that balance, but those are things that will come up in your deliberations. And the city planning commissioners have leverage, right? So when these conflicts do come up, I completely just appreciate all your responses, but you will have the opportunity to push those applicants to make changes, right? And so it's helpful to hear how you're going to be thinking about that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Sanchez. I'm going to now have a few questions, some follow-ups from earlier. Thank you all for your taking the time. I want to just go through some testimony and other questions that came up and just ask some follow-ups. I'm just going to start with Ms. Kermani Fry. In your testimony, you had mentioned It's critical that the mayor, council, communities, DCP, and CPC work together to speed up the process of creating deeply affordable housing. Can you give me some specific examples that you might recommend to do that?
So thank you for the question and for being here. So I think, and this has come up in some of my other responses, that rezoning takes a long time. The ULUP process can take a long time. I don't have specific solutions, but I think that how we can shorten that time should be a priority for both the DCP and CPC to really talk about, evaluate, and put recommendations forward. So that's my short answer.
Okay. So just to follow up on that, so for instance, would you be supportive of speeding up the ULURP process in projects where there's a certain percentage of affordable housing that is included in the project?
I don't want to commit to agreeing to something specifically, but as a concept and philosophically, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osorio, when you're talking to Councilmember Borelli on his question on infrastructure, which should come first, infrastructure versus development, you had noted that you think the infrastructure should come first, is the way I heard it. I think that the colleague sitting next to you had sort of made a note that that could potentially leave projects decades. When we talk about infrastructure, we're using a vague, obviously, it's a vague concept, but certainly might include mass transportation, it might include sewer systems, it might include many other things that folks would consider infrastructure, yet leave many neighborhoods potentially undeveloped or underdeveloped or not meeting their affordable housing goals under the guise of waiting for infrastructure to come first, which I think was probably the point of Councilmember Borelli in his question. So I just want to revisit that for a second. How do you respond to that? That there would be potentially, I think as I said, the candidate sitting next to you had noted the tension that takes place in those two items, and that we would. So how do we do infrastructure first if that potentially leaves us with swaths of the city that would be under or undeveloped?
Thank you for your question. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify and reiterate that I'm referring to the lack of investment and the lack of the histories of a lack of infrastructure, access to open space amenities, mass transit, et cetera, as a matter of environmental justice, social justice. And therefore, I wanted to elevate meeting the need as a top priority, separate from the need to accommodate further growth, and specifically clarify that those needs should be met with or without accommodating new growth. However, I also want to acknowledge that we can't do that alone, and we have to find ways to activate all of our resources, including activating the private sector in expediting the process and subsidizing or financing, in some cases, the construction of this infrastructure. But I just wanted to go back to the idea that growth is sometimes a given, and in many cases used to justify the need for rezonings in cases where that may not be the only solution or the only alternative to it. I think that what we do need is comprehensive planning that is constantly finding ways, creative opportunities to build this infrastructure so that these communities can thrive.
Just a follow-up on that. So we hear from all the candidates, we've heard a lot of talking about the sort of community input and the need for incorporating the communities and feedback into the projects. But I think often we find communities at odds with the developmental world when it comes to things like building affordable housing, when it comes to projects that include infrastructure upgrades, so the growth in areas where there might be transit, housing, schools, things like that. So this is a question for all three of you, I suppose. How do you approach that when the community, when there's a project that is meeting the citywide goals or meeting even regional goals when it comes to housing, maybe providing other amenities and upgrades as well, versus what the community is saying? And I think for Mr. Osorio, particularly being BP's recommendation, he also have a part of the process in the projects that come through Brooklyn. So how do you also handle and account for his feedback when it comes to which comes before you in the process when evaluating and analyzing and then ultimately voting and having to whether support or oppose a project? I guess we could start with you and then go down to your colleagues.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate that. It gives me an opportunity to say that oftentimes we make assumptions about how communities are going to respond to proposals. And I would say interpreting reactions, skepticism about proposals and reactions against potential development projects as necessarily opposition to growth or development, where I think that in a lot of cases what we're hearing is frustration of communities against the planning process, particularly in neighborhoods where communities have spent a lot of time putting their plans together, as we've been discussing throughout the hearing, learn about these proposals at the last minute, and then are asked to respond when, in many cases, some of these projects are actually already sort of ready to be implemented. So I think that we should be careful in terms of distinguishing between frustration and the assumption that communities will be against, or some communities may be necessarily against accommodating for future
Can I
growth.
just follow up on that, and then I'll come to the other guys. Don't both exist, though? Isn't there a trend of opposition against new development in communities throughout the city, whether you go into Midtown Manhattan, which I represent, to Staten Island, to other areas of the city? There is a frustration with the process, undoubtedly. But I do think you solve for some of those frustrations. You make the ULURP process longer, you have a pre-ULURP process, you do comprehensive planning, stuff like that. That will not unlock, to me, that will not necessarily unlock support entirely from communities. I do think it will relieve pressure from them and potentially open up opportunities for more input in identifying sites for things. But I don't want to, just be fair, I don't want to let you off the hook for that answer. I think that there is a tension that still exists where there is an opposition to growth, and we have to unlock that. And so yeah, go ahead.
No, thank you. I just want to respond to what you said, because I agree with what you said. This exists, this is real, and this is part of the planning process. But I think that that's what the CPC is there for, too. I mean, we all have very specific roles in ULURP, but the CPC is there to produce and oversee the type of research required to make sure that all of these perspectives are heard, and at the end of the day, that we have a system to be able to balance them. I also just wanted to say, just as you point out that there are places that may necessarily have very fixed positions on this, that there are other places where communities are not just against development, but they have their own version of what development could look like, and that's important too. The CPC is uniquely positioned to be able to facilitate that process.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And that last point was actually my first point in my head. So I totally agree with my colleague. And I 100% agree with you that, that is the reality, too. That whether it's Midtown or Coney Island or wherever, that there is that tension, even within communities, of folks in communities who are defining growth one way, other folks who are defining it another way, and then there's a whole tension about, no, we don't want growth. And I think, like so many terms, and this may sound too academic, but I don't think that it is, how are communities defining growth? I think people hear it and assume that it also means, just like we may rush to the assumption of skepticism, communities hear growth, and what do they think that means? Do they think that it means immediately gentrification, being priced out, or can it mean that there is an openness to have conversations about what growth means in communities? And I do think that there are processes that could kind of speed up that discussion. And we're always going to be burdened, I think appropriately, with, in many communities, a healthy mistrust of planning process. Pick your government agency, a mistrust of that particular workflow or system, and how do we begin to build back the trust. I mean, it happens every day. You take one step forward, one step back, you keep showing up, you keep having the conversations. But I think so often, if we can move closer to like co-governance and co-creation and having these honest conversations, we can get through that frustrating point, but it's always going to be there.
Thanks.
So I think that answer sort of starts and ends with the word compromise, because at the end of the day, I think the community, as I said, is very important. But to your point, there may be some communities who don't want to do their part, right? I mean, every community really has to do their part. And in a perfect world, everyone accepts that and understands it. So I think at the end of the day, the role of the process really is to balance that, right? It's to balance the concept that there are some who don't want to do enough on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are needs for the city, affordable housing and otherwise. So as I think about the process, I think the process has a number of opportunities. Community input is super important. I think we've all said that, and I think we can all agree on that. But there's also the borough president's lens. There's also the council members' lens. There's also the CPC, and there's also the council. And it seems to me that many of the ULURPs, basically, at the end, if they don't get to the right answer, they do get modified by the council and they do come back. So there is room in there, and I think much of the process has to basically think about it from the standpoint of a good compromise is better than a loss on both sides.
Just to follow up on that, I don't disagree with the idea that compromise and a process sort of can benefit, create tension to create a compromise, although it feels like that's not the case these days. It seems like there is a change in terms of how few folks view compromise and whether that is the goal, by the way. So how does one address that?
So how does one adjust? Sorry, say it again.
How do you adjust for the fact that, whether in the process or in the processes that exist or in the policy making about how to, if compromise would to be the goal, that it seems like that perhaps is not?
So I think it's a couple of things. I think one, in the role of commissioner, it's working with the Department of City Planning to be sure that there's the proper mindset, if you will. But second, thinking about the commission as a whole with, I guess is it 12 or 13 members, there's always that balance of compromise and making sure that there are enough different viewpoints in the room. And so one wants to have that discussion, one wants to invite the discussion, and you certainly want to know what the viewpoints are, but at the same time, just like the different, the pro-development folks versus the anti-development folks, even in the room on the commission, I believe you have enough different viewpoints where you do work to get to a healthy compromise, and I think folks have to want to do it. So I think I can raise my hand and say I want to do that.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it at that since we have such a captive audience here of people still paying attention. Did you have a, Can I add
something to that question? Thanks again for the question. I think that I just wanted to emphasize that the CPC should be a space for debate where these different opinions should actually sort of enter dialogue. I think that's actually one of the main problems that I see right now with the process, which is that in hearings, rarely there's a conversation between the community, the applicant, and the commission in engaging into the complexity of understanding where those compromises actually sort of lie and to what extent they can be enforced. I wanted to just say that creating the transparency, creating a transparent process where everybody can relate to the methodologies and see sort of like how we're making decisions in a way that those compromises are clear in terms of who's winning and who's not, and then how do we compensate for that, actually is what builds that trust. We're, in many cases, when we increase the capacity for development, we're creating a lot of wealth out of thin air. And I think at the end of the process, this is about how do we make decisions? How do we direct investments which should be based on need? And to what extent a lot of this value can be recaptured so that everybody can win in this way.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you guys for answering. So thank you for your patience and staying with us, and congratulations to you on your nomination. And this is I think without question, one of the most important city agencies that we have, and this, and your appointments hopefully will further that. But I think you're all very qualified, and your answers have given a lot more confidence, I think, to all of us that you have thought about these questions and have taken this job seriously. So I want to congratulate you all on that nomination, and thank you for spending your morning, afternoon with us as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you
With
so
that,
much.
we are adjourned.
Thanks so much for the time
Thank you, guys.
and the interest.